General Hospital Spoilers reveal that Brennan had always operated in the blurred spaces between trust and betrayal, between intelligence and manipulation. And now it's becoming increasingly evident that the true threat may not have been Professor Dalton after all. While early suspicions centered on Dalton's underground research and unethical experiments, all signs are starting to point elsewhere, to Brennan himself, the so-called observer. The quiet strategist who sat through briefings, coordinated efforts with Vaughn and Jocelyn, and delivered warnings about intelligence leaks with surgical precision. It was easy to believe he was simply monitoring Dalton's growing instability, keeping a lid on a dangerous laboratory operation. But that facade is beginning to crack. Brennan's increasingly cryptic behavior and his unnerving calm during moments of chaos suggest a different reality, one where he's not the cleanup crew for Dalton's mistakes but the architect of the entire operation from the very beginning. The clues have always been there, subtle yet undeniable. His conversations with Vaughn are layered not just with directives but with veiled hints of control. His so-called strategy sessions with Jocelyn show him laying the groundwork not to dismantle Dalton's empire, but to tighten his grip over it. The real twist, however, emerges in his connection to Britt. On the surface, the narrative has suggested Britt may be working under Dalton, possibly blackmailed or coerced into acting as a courier of sensitive data. But what if Dalton isn't the one giving the orders? What if Britt's return, her haunting presence at the airport, and her presumed mission are all part of Brennan's long game, a game that involves psychologically turning Britt into his instrument, not through force, but through finely calibrated persuasion? Brennan, after all, is not a brute force operator. He's a psychological tactician. The kind of man who plays the long game, exploiting weaknesses, childhood trauma, emotional vulnerabilities, and fractured loyalties. Britt, with her history of rejection, guilt, and her desperate desire to rewrite her legacy, makes for a perfect subject. What if, in her lowest moments, when she was believed to be dead, isolated, forgotten, Brennan was the one who found her? What if he didn't imprison her but gave her purpose, offered her a second chance under a new identity, and fed her just enough lies to convince her that working for him was the only path forward? If Brennan has been pulling the strings behind Britt's re-entry into Port Charles, then her presence is not an accident, it's a calculated reactivation. This changes everything. Dalton, though brilliant and ethically compromised, may have never been in charge. His delays in research, his vague references to an unnamed investor, and his growing paranoia all begin to make sense if he too is under Brennan's thumb. It would mean the entire operation, from experimental human trials to intelligence smuggling, is just one gear in Brennan's larger machine. And now, with Britt moving again, visible to people like Jason and possibly even Jocelyn, the machine has started turning toward Port Charles in full force. The implications are terrifying. Because Britt isn't just a lost soul coming home, she's a ticking time bomb, possibly carrying sensitive data, biological samples, or even commands she doesn't fully understand. Her loyalty to Jason, her love for those she left behind, could all be used against her, or worse, she may not even remember enough to stop herself. This possibility introduces a new level of psychological warfare. Brennan hasn't just corrupted science, he's corrupted memory, identity, and trust. And his weaponization of Britt suggests that no one is safe. Jason's emotional reaction upon seeing her at the airport could be exactly what Brennan wanted, a distraction. While Jason reels from the shock of seeing the woman he thought he lost, Brennan could be setting the next stage of his plan into motion. Britt's arrival might be designed to destabilize Jason emotionally, to weaken him ahead of a larger offensive. And if Brennan is willing to use someone like Britt to bait Jason, it begs the question, who else in Port Charles is already working for Brennan without realizing it? The notion that Brennan is orchestrating everything, that his hand is behind Britt's return, Dalton's research delays, and even Sidwell's growing panic, reframes the entire power dynamic. Brennan isn't just a WSB offshoot or a handler. He's a warlord in disguise, hiding behind suits and strategy tables, controlling chaos from a distance. And if Britt has truly become his emissary, then her reintroduction is more than a plot twist, it's a declaration of war. The people of Port Charles may still be looking toward Dalton's lab for answers. But the real battlefield has already shifted. It's in every conversation Britt has, every place she visits, every person she touches. Because if Brennan has his way, her presence will unravel the town from within, one emotional fracture at a time. This growing realization underscores a deeper, darker truth, that Brennan has been building toward this moment for years, possibly longer. His connection to Britt may go further back than anyone suspects. Perhaps their paths crossed during one of her previous disappearances, or during her time presumed dead. Maybe he orchestrated that death as the beginning of a larger reset, not just for her, but for the town itself. If Britt was a test subject, then Port Charles is now the lab. And Brennan is watching, calculating, preparing for the moment he finally reveals just how much control he truly has. The disaster is no longer theoretical. It has already begun. And no one, not Jason, not Anna, not even Dalton, truly understands the magnitude of the threat Brennan represents. But they will. Soon. Britt had once been known for her sharp intellect, her emotional complexity, and the unmistakable spark of defiance in her eyes, but the woman who has returned to Port Charles no longer moves with the same purpose. There is something quieter, more restrained, almost mechanical in her presence, as if the soul beneath her skin has been redirected, rewritten, perhaps even fractured beyond recognition. The unsettling truth emerging is that Britt is no longer simply a returning figure, she is a manifestation of someone else's agenda. And that someone is Brennan, the silent manipulator, the calculating architect of chaos who has turned control into an art form. Britt has become the canvas on which he's painting his most dangerous masterpiece. What makes this revelation so disturbing isn't just the idea that Brennan is controlling her, it's the depth of that control, the precision with which he seems to understand Britt's vulnerabilities. Her pain, her desire to atone, and the guilt that still clings to every mistake she ever made. He has found a way to exploit her completely, not just as a tool for surveillance or infiltration, but as a living weapon, someone capable of walking directly into the emotional center of Port Charles undetected, and detonating everything. There were subtle hints early on. Jason sensed it the moment he laid eyes on her. The woman who once challenged him, loved him, sacrificed for him, now stood before him as if caught in a dream she didn't fully understand. Her eyes looked at him, but the connection wasn't the same. It wasn't just that she had changed, it was that she seemed to be moving on a different frequency altogether. One calibrated to something deeper, more dangerous. Liesel, too, began to notice. Her instincts as both a scientist and a mother figure led her to the same quiet, terrifying conclusion. Britt wasn't just back, she had been brought back. By someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And the consequences of that are already beginning to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. What Brennan has done isn't just tactical, it's psychological warfare. He didn't force Britt into obedience with threats or violence. He rewrote her purpose by targeting the very core of her identity. He found her at her weakest, likely after she faked her death or was declared gone, and instead of imprisoning her, he offered her something far more seductive, the chance to matter again. The promise of redemption. The illusion of usefulness. But in doing so, he planted seeds of manipulation that have since blossomed into full-blown obsession. Whether Britt realizes it or not, she is now executing a mission that aligns perfectly with Brennan's endgame. Her every step brings chaos. Her reappearance stirs memories, reopens wounds, and destabilizes the emotional alliances of Port Charles. But more than that, she is moving data. Accessing restricted systems, and triggering hidden protocols, things only someone with high-level clearance or conditioning could do. And while Dalton was once believed to be the mastermind behind the experimental chaos, it's becoming increasingly likely that even he was only a pawn in Brennan's game. Dalton may have designed the science, but Brennan authored the war. He understood the emotional landscape of the town better than anyone, who trusted whom, who carried guilt, who could be pushed, and into that fragile web he inserted Britt like a virus programmed to spread. She's not carrying a weapon in her hand, but the threat she represents is far greater. She may be carrying secrets, biological data, encoded messages, access points to systems the WSB itself can't crack, all without fully knowing what she's been conditioned to do with them. And that's what makes her terrifying. Because Britt believes she's come back to find herself. But what if she's come back to destroy everything she once loved? And still, somewhere deep beneath the layers of programming and psychological control, there are moments when the real Britt fights to break through. A flash of recognition in Jason's voice. The name Rocco spoken aloud. The memory of her brother Nathan's funeral. These tiny sparks of humanity still live within her, buried but not extinguished. And that is what Brennan fears the most, that the emotional connections Britt still carries could override his conditioning. That love, loyalty, and memory might snap the chains he so carefully constructed. But for now, Britt remains his most dangerous asset. Because she walks unnoticed among the people she once called family. And her silence is the camouflage for the most volatile operation Port Charles has ever seen. As the days pass, more anomalies begin to surface. Surveillance networks begin rerouting data. Sidwell receives encrypted communications that vanish before they can be traced. WSB operatives report breaches in containment protocols without any evidence of infiltration. All signs point to Britt's movements. And Jason, torn between protecting her and uncovering the truth, is left in a state of emotional paralysis. He wants to believe that Britt is still the woman he once risked everything for. But the evidence piling up says otherwise. Every second she remains free is a second closer to disaster. Brennan has designed it perfectly, because by the time anyone figures out what Britt is truly doing, it will already be too late. And what happens when Britt discovers the truth? When she realizes that the memories she trusted, the mission she believed in, the second chance she clung to, were all lies Brennan fed her to turn her into a weapon? Will she implode under the weight of betrayal? Or will she turn on Brennan with the same intensity that once made her dangerous in her own right? That remains the final mystery, and the town may not survive long enough to see the answer. Because Britt is the epicenter of a storm no one can stop. Not yet. Not while Brennan's shadow stretches across every move she makes. And as Port Charles prepares for another wave of loss and revelation. One thing becomes chillingly clear: the Britt they knew may never return, and the Britt that remains could burn the whole town down without even knowing she struck the match. Carly had faced betrayal before, she had weathered storms that would have broken weaker people, but nothing in her long history of turmoil had prepared her for the brutal, cold realization that Brennan, someone embedded deep within their trust structures, had not only betrayed them but had orchestrated something much darker. Much more insidious than anyone could have imagined. The information she uncovered didn't come with fire or chaos, it came quietly. Through a series of data fragments Jason had recovered and passed on, thinking they were minor threads. But Carly, trusting her instincts sharpened by a lifetime of protecting her family, began to dig deeper, connecting dots that no one else had seen. What she found was not only shocking, it was transformative. It changed everything she thought she knew about Brennan, about the WSB. About the network of emotional manipulation that had been silently growing around her and those she loved. Brennan wasn't a strategist, he wasn't a passive observer. He was the architect of psychological warfare, and he had been pulling strings behind the scenes for longer than anyone realized. This was not just a plan or an operation, it was a controlled detonation, one emotional trigger at a time. Britt's return, so perfectly timed, so emotionally disruptive, was no coincidence. Jocelyn's slow entanglement in shadow missions, Michael's downward spiral with painkillers, Liesl's reemergence, Jason's subtle paranoia, all of it connected. Brennan's influence was not direct. It was subdermal, like a virus infecting a town from within, changing its heart and soul cell by cell until no one even remembered who they were before it started. The worst part wasn't just that he had done it, it was that he had used emotional leverage to do it, turning grief into currency, trust into blindness, and hope into a weapon. Carly felt physically sick as she read through the documentation in front of her, realizing Brennan had tested neurological influence protocols on people he knew had unresolved trauma. Building predictive behavioral maps based on emotional volatility. And in every map, she saw the same core subjects: Jason, Jocelyn, Britt, Willow, and even Sasha. But there was a center to it all. A fixed point that everything rotated around: her. Carly was the gateway Brennan had used to control everyone else. Because he knew that Carly would do anything to protect the people she loved. That her rage would make her impulsive. That her heartbreak would make her predictable. And now, she realized, Brennan hadn't underestimated her, he had studied her. Perfectly. Systematically. The file she found was laced with biometric data, emotional response tracking, psychological projections. But most disturbing of all were the timestamps. Brennan had been compiling this data for years. Long before his name ever emerged in WSB briefings. Long before she even knew he existed. This wasn't about revenge. It was obsession. Controlled. Scientific obsession. He had made Carly the center of an emotional experiment and turned the town of Port Charles into a controlled arena. Each move he made was to provoke her into a specific course of action. Every choice she thought was hers had been designed. Every conflict that felt random had been engineered. And now that she had discovered the truth, she wasn't just a threat, she was the final phase of his plan. The moment she acted, Brennan would move. The moment she tried to fix what he had broken, he would trigger what came next. And yet, there was no turning back. Carly had lived through grief that nearly destroyed her. She had lost Morgan, seen Sonny collapse into darkness. Watched Michael grow cold and distant, and yet still fought to hold her family together. But Brennan had found the cracks and widened them. He had whispered lies through trusted channels. Made friends turn suspicious, turned allies into watchers. Jason, once the steadiest presence in her world, had been isolated under the guise of secret missions. Liesel, once a trusted if unpredictable ally, was suddenly too preoccupied with Rocco and Britt to see the greater danger. Jocelyn, her daughter, now followed WSB protocols more loyally than her own instincts, and Carly knew that wasn't just discipline, it was manipulation. Brennan had done more than infiltrate. He had redesigned the emotional hierarchy of the town. Everyone thought they were making choices. In reality, they were reacting to impulses Brennan had installed. Still, Carly knew something Brennan didn't. For all his data, for all his equations, he didn't understand love. He understood loyalty as behavior, grief as a pattern, but he didn't understand the raw, irrational, explosive force of maternal love, of emotional rage unchained by logic. He didn't understand that once Carly knew she was being used, she wouldn't fall apart. She would rise. And she would take everything he built and rip it to shreds. Because this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about justice. She wasn't just fighting for Jason, or Jocelyn, or Britt. She was fighting for everyone who had unknowingly been forced into Brennan's game. And she would not let him win. Not when she now saw how far he had already gone. Britt was being used like a sleeper agent, carrying secrets she didn't know she held. Jason was being set up to take the fall for operational breaches. Michael's medical records had been tampered with, and his prescriptions were being rerouted. Willow's custody over Wiley and Amelia was being leveraged as a psychological anchor. Meant to keep her obedient and emotionally fragile. And now, Carly saw, her own movements were being mirrored. Every message, every confrontation. Even her conversations with Sonny, all of it was being fed into a system designed to predict her next move. She wasn't just being watched. She was being processed. But if Brennan expected her to play her role and collapse, he had severely underestimated the woman who had clawed her way through every fire and come out stronger. There would be no grand confrontation. No warning. Carly would do what she did best. She would move quietly, strike precisely, and tear his control apart from the inside. She would find the flaws in his system, the emotional leverage points he couldn't calculate, and she would use them as weapons. Brennan believed she was predictable. But Carly had always had one advantage: she could surprise even herself. And now, she would use that chaos against him. Because for the first time in a long time, Carly wasn't reacting. She was planning. And Brennan, for all his data and obsession, had just become her target. Jason and Anna, two of the most resilient and relentless forces in Port Charles, are on a collision course with one of the darkest manipulations ever to take root in their world. Their mission: to save Britt from a carefully orchestrated descent into psychological captivity. What began as a series of seemingly disconnected disturbances, Britt's reappearance under strange circumstances, the lab files linked to Brennan, and encrypted behavioral data unearthed by Carly, has now crystallized into one undeniable truth: Britt is being controlled, and the longer she remains under Brennan's influence, the more damage she may unknowingly unleash. Jason, whose bond with Britt once promised a new chapter of redemption and healing, never stopped believing that something of the real Britt still survived beneath the layers of confusion and manipulation. His instincts told him this wasn't a simple case of betrayal or mental collapse. There was precision behind her behavior. A pattern that didn't fit Britt's old recklessness or independence. It was too calm, too clean, too calculated. He knew what it looked like to be used as a weapon. He had been one himself. And now he saw it happening again through her. Anna, with her background in intelligence and deep understanding of how minds can be weaponized, was quicker to piece together the bigger picture. She had seen the signs long before anyone else dared to admit them. The coding in Britt's medical charts, the erratic security clearances she accessed, the lab interactions with Dalton that didn't make sense, these weren't anomalies. They were the footprints of someone being led down a carefully crafted path. And when Anna reviewed Brennan's encrypted research files alongside the WSB's classified neural mapping experiments, it confirmed what she feared. Britt was the prototype of an emotional sleeper agent, a test subject in Brennan's psychological warfare agenda. Together, Jason and Anna now represent the last barrier between Britt and total collapse. They've started to act in secret, tracking Brennan's hidden communications, intercepting his influence network, and most dangerously, tracing the biochemical pathways he may have introduced into Britt's system through the time she was missing. But this is no longer just a rescue mission, it's a race against time. Because the deeper they go, the clearer it becomes that Brennan doesn't just want control, he wants proof. Proof that love, memory, and identity can all be overwritten by fear and obedience. Britt isn't just a pawn, she's the thesis of his experiment. Jason knows that the woman he once loved is still there, locked behind layers of programming and trauma. Anna believes that if they reach her soon enough, before Brennan pushes the final trigger, they can bring her back. But both understand the cost. Brennan has prepared for this. His traps are already in place, from false leads to psychological triggers embedded in Britt's environment. Any wrong step could either push Britt further into his grasp or unleash an emotional outburst powerful enough to harm those around her. But this is where Jason and Anna thrive, on the edge of the impossible. They are not driven by protocol or fear. They are driven by personal history, emotional truth, and the unbearable weight of watching someone they care about become a tool of destruction. And in that fire of shared purpose, something new is rising, an intensity, an obsession, a change. Their alliance isn't just strategic anymore. It's personal, born from the realization that they are both haunted by the people they couldn't save in the past. But Britt won't be one of them. Not this time. The obsession to save her is rising, pushing them to their limits. And as the world around them begins to spiral further into chaos, as Brennan tightens his control over Port Charles, Jason and Anna are moving with more urgency, more precision, and more emotional fire than ever before. They are preparing not only to save Britt but to expose Brennan, dismantle his network, and burn down the entire operation he's built. This isn't just about stopping a madman. It's about restoring someone's identity, someone's soul. And in doing so, Jason and Anna are also saving pieces of themselves, pieces that were long buried in regret and silence. What comes next will not be easy. There will be consequences. There will be sacrifice. But Britt matters. Her life, her mind, her freedom, it all matters. And with every step Jason and Anna take, with every coded message they decrypt, with every ally they pull into their orbit, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: the obsession to reclaim what was taken is no longer just theirs, it's part of something larger, something transforming them. And something that may redefine the future of Port Charles forever.